Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Melbourne Traditionalists, episode 55. Today, I want to talk about Aborigines, particularly Australian Aborigines. Now, it's not a topic that we on the right talk about very often, but I think that we should from time to time. Now, first of all, I'd like to tell you the difference between Aboriginal and Indigenous, because some people get very caught up on these terms. So let's start with Aboriginal. Any of the original inhabitants of a country. That's all it means. It comes from Latin, and in Roman mythology, the Aborigines were the original inhabitants of central Italy. Not Australian Aborigines, of course, but all over the world, the first people are the Aboriginal people. So whoever's there first, they're Aboriginal. But for some reason, I'm not quite certain why it has come to mean, to many people, exclusively just Australian Aborigines. But of course, that's not true. Now, some people will say, "Oh, you can't say Aborigine; it's offensive." The First People is obviously not offensive. They'll say, "Oh, you have to use Indigenous." So, what does Indigenous means? It means originating in or being native to a particular place. Now, the only real difference between Aboriginal and Indigenous is that Aboriginal only applies to people, whereas animals, plants, and people can be Indigenous. Now, one of the things that we also hear about another Indigenous group, the Torres Strait Islanders. Now, I'm not certain whether they are actually Aboriginal, whether they are the first people to occupy the Torres Straits, but they are not Aboriginal people as most people understand them. They are Melanesian people, and so they are ethnically different, racially different to Australian Aboriginals. And they have their own language and they have their own culture, and they're much more like people from Papua New Guinea, which is where they are originally from. Although exactly when they arrived in the Torres Straits is an area of great academic dispute. As is when the first Aborigines came to Australia. It was once accepted that they came here. The very first people who asked the question thought they came here about 4000 BC. And then in the 20th century, it was accepted they came here 20,000 years ago. And then that was pushed back to 40,000. And now it's accepted that they're somewhere between 60 and 70,000. Although there are some who say that they were here as long ago as 90,000 years ago, which would be quite remarkable. Now, how did they get to Australia? They got to Australia because of the Ice Age. There have been multiple ice ages. There's been an ice age about every 20,000 years. And at one of those times, the difference between Asia and Australia, which at that time would have included Papua New Guinea and a lot of the islands that are now part of Indonesia, the eastern part of Indonesia, and they just would have been able to probably swim across because they would have been able to see the far shore. But what is certain is that the Aboriginal people are a unique and distinct people, and their relationship to other peoples is quite distant. The Aboriginal people themselves obviously have their mythology, what they call the dream time. And in the dream time, the land was made by the rainbow serpent. And the rainbow serpent basically created all the rivers and all the gullies and all the hills. In southeastern Australia, it's an eagle, a giant eagle, that created the land. But what's remarkable is that there are so many different languages within Aboriginal Australia. There are about 250, and there are also about that many tribes. Not every tribe has its own language, but it's nearly, it's close. But Aboriginal society across Australia is actually fairly homogenous. You'll find the same types of way of life all across Australia in traditional Aboriginal society. Many of the same rituals and the same ideas and the same customs were held right across the Australian continent, even though most Aborigines simply knew their own local area. They didn't know the other areas. And as I said, 250 plus different languages. That's quite remarkable. One of the other things that's quite remarkable is just how long the Aboriginal people were isolated from the rest of the world for tens of thousands of years. And even it's only at least since the 1500s. That's the earliest date that anybody from outside Australia may have actually visited Australia. The very first that we can know for certain occurred in 1606 when a Dutch merchant ship that was going to New Guinea actually found Cape York, and they landed on Cape York, and they were ambushed by local Aborigines, and there was a small battle. Men were killed on both sides, and the Dutch went, wow, we don't want this, there's nothing here, and they sailed away. Now, one of the great ironies is that the Dutch had, before Captain Cook came along, the Dutch had the most experience of Australia, and every encounter that they had with Australia was, there's nothing here of any value, because they were primarily merchants. They wanted to sail into a port, trade, and sail away, and that there was nothing like that in Australia. Now, just near the very first encounter in Cape York, there's these mountains of minerals, which today are making hundreds of millions of dollars for Australia. But the Dutch looked at it and went, that's just worthless, and they sailed away. That's not because they were stupid, it's because actually in 1606 it was useless. You needed a lot of technology that simply didn't exist. But other peoples may have come to Australia. But there's two peoples, great seafaring peoples, who sailed very close to Australia but never found Australia. The first of those are the Arabs. Now, we think of the Arabs as a desert people, which of course they are, but they were also great seafarers, and they had sea routes all the way from Arabia to China, from Arabia to the Spice Islands, which are just to the west of New Guinea, and all the way down at the east coast of Africa to Madagascar. So they covered an enormous area of ocean, but they never came to Australia. There's absolutely no evidence that they came to Australia or that they even knew that it existed. And then on the other side, we have the Polynesians. And the Polynesians were also great seafaring people. They went all the way to South America. We know that they reached South America because some artifacts have been found there. But we don't know whether that was a regular thing, shipwreck or what have you. We just know that they actually did get there at some point. But of course, they did colonise all the islands of the Pacific. That's a pretty big achievement, but there's absolutely no evidence that they ever found Australia. People who did find Australia are known as the Makassars. And the Makassars come from what's now Indonesia, what's called the island of Sulawesi, just to the east of Borneo. And they came to Australia, to Arnhem Land, to get the sea cucumber. And sea cucumbers are an animal. They live on the bottom of the ocean, and divers would dive down and get them. And they were considered a great delicacy in China. Now, Chinese didn't know about Malacca, and Malacca didn't know about China, but they still managed to trade with each other. Now, we definitely know that they came to Australia, and the earliest that we absolutely know is 1720. But there are people who say at least 1700, And there are other people who say the mid 1600s. And then there are other people who say, no, the 1500s. There's no evidence for those. Well, actually, very little evidence. There is some evidence. The most of this is based on Aboriginal rock art, because the ships changed over time, so they can actually record the ships. And also we found swivel guns, small naval guns in northern Australia. And every time this happens, the first time was in 1916, the most recent in 2012, every time it's the Portuguese. Right, the Portuguese came to Australia, but actually these cannons were all made in Southeast Asia, so we know that they were from the Malaccas. Now, the Portuguese and the Spanish are also great seafaring nations, and they contributed to the discovery of Australia, even though, to our knowledge, they never sighted Australia. There's no evidence that they came to Australia. The Portuguese, of course, had a big empire in what's now Indonesia, but there's no evidence that they actually came south. Even though it's only a few hundred kilometres, they just didn't do it. Or at least there's no evidence that they did it. And the Spanish came very close to discovering Australia. Torres Strait is named after the Spanish explorer Torres, and he set sail from Peru and he sailed across the Pacific. He sailed through the Torres Straits. He named it, or in the Torres Sea, and he kept going. But there's no evidence that he actually saw Australia. Now, traditional Aboriginal culture is known as a gerontology, which means rule by elders. So when we think about Aboriginal culture, we shouldn't think about chiefs or any type of leadership as we think of it. Everything's by consensus. And the older men, they make the decisions for the men and for the tribe, and the older women make the decisions for the women and for the children. And that means that they get the most respect, they get the most resources, and it also means that they got the young wives. So this was a major source of contention within traditional Aboriginal society, that young men had no right to a bride, but old men did. And when a child was born, a baby girl was born, she would be promised to an older man, and he could be quite old by Aboriginal standards. So that meant that when she came of age, the only way that she could marry somebody else was what was called bride stealing. So a man would actually come and he would kidnap her. And in Aboriginal culture, this was actually considered quite romantic, because it was love winning out against the establishment. And I'm sure in reality, some of those were love interests. And of course, in others, they weren't. But whether it was wanted or not, the man then became an outlaw, but the woman was now bound to him. And that's the way Aboriginal society was. All young men were warriors. That was their primary function. Their job was to fight wars. And they did fight wars. They fought pitched battles, which didn't usually result in many casualties, but they certainly took place, and in raids and skirmishes, which could take place at any time. Aboriginal society could be very, very violent, and if you believe Buckley's accounts, which I think are credible, that included the women. The women were very violent as well. But talking about women were they were second-class citizens. They didn't have any rights. And in fact, I should talk about Aboriginal property. Aborigines didn't have property. Sure, they owned their clothes, they owned their spear or things like that. So it wasn't like they had absolutely no property. but they didn't own things like we understand it, right? There really was nothing to own, and that includes land. Aboriginal people regarded land as their mother. You can't own your mother. Your mother gave you life, and you should love your mother. You should respect your mother. You should treat your mother well. So when people today talk about, this is Aboriginal land, well, it can't be, because Aboriginal people can't own land, because you can't own your mother, right? And it's also why traditionally Aboriginals have been against buildings and against development in general, because they have considered it to be a scar. You wouldn't take a knife and walk up to your mother and run it across her face. That's how Aboriginal people feel about the land. You can't disfigure it. You can't scar it, which is a bit strange, because Aboriginal society did scar people, particularly men. Ceremonial scars were something that a man was supposed to have. A warrior was supposed to have scars, and when he went from being a boy to being a man, he was to be initiated, and often that involved obtaining ritual scars. And some of them are pretty horrific if you've seen some of the photographs. Now, women were actually one of the few things that you could actually regard as property. Now, Aboriginal people didn't have slavery because their society was so primitive that they didn't really have a use for slaves. Slaves were a burden, so they didn't have slaves. They didn't take prisoners because as I said, they were a burden. But women were bound to men, and they didn't have a right to make decisions. Aboriginal society was traditional in that, in practical terms, women did not have political power. All women had was influence and sex and, whispering in the ear and all those things that women have always had and are now losing. So women did have power, but they didn't have official power. And if you'd said to an Aboriginal person, "Oh, women have power," they would have laughed at you. Women don't have any power. Now, the idea about children is actually quite interesting. When they looked up at the night sky, they actually said that the stars are future children. And they're looking down and they're observing human behaviour. And children choose their parents. So the stars are looking down and deciding who's naughty and who's nice, and who they would like to have as their parent. And then when a woman became pregnant, it was because she had been chosen by this child. So children had this semi-divine status in Aboriginal society. And what that meant was that children couldn't be disciplined. Children couldn't be hit. Now, Aboriginal society was actually very violent, and if a man committed a great sin, which included even breaking taboos, the accepted punishment was that he'd be speared. Now, generally, a spear was in the thigh, so he had a chance. He might live, but he might die. That's the chance. But you weren't allowed to hit children, because children were divine. And that means that they grew up without discipline. Now, they could be taught, they could be instructed, but once you reach, I think it was about 13, that's when everything started to change. That's when Aboriginal life became much, much more serious. From then on, that's when you become a man. That's when you start getting ritual scars. That's when you become expected to go on hunts and to fight. And those things were dangerous. So you have this really bizarre divide between childhood, which, as far as food and resources go, is idyllic, and then adulthood, which is really quite harsh. Now, we're often told that the great tragedy of the Australian Aborigines is settlement, that they had this idyllic lifestyle. Well, hey, and when everything was going well, it probably was idyllic. But when it was flood and drought, it was probably pretty horrific. And so we're told that that the coming of the white man is the tragedy of the Aborigines, and that we destroyed their traditional way of life, which is true. That there were massacres, and we took their land, and so on and so forth. But actually, I disagree. And what I think that I do agree that those things were tragic, but I disagree that is the great tragedy of Aboriginal life. The great tragedy is that the very worst aspect of Aboriginal life continued, and the very worst aspects of whites were adopted by Aborigines. So Aborigines didn't have alcohol. They did have a form of alcohol, but not as strong as what we have. And we introduced it to them. And to be honest, their bodies, their minds can't handle it. But it's now a solid part of Aboriginal society, of Aboriginal culture, right? Drinking and hard drinking to excess, drinking to violence. These are things that exist in white society as well, but we actually say, hey, that's a bad thing. But in Aboriginal society, it's been accepted that, hey, this is how it is. And, that extends to things like, we read about sexual abuse in Aboriginal communities, and we say to ourselves, well, that's terrible, these people should be punished. Well, that's certainly true. But why does this kind of thing happen? Well, remember when I was talking before about how older men were the ones who were given the babies. No, they weren't given babies. I'm misspeaking there. The baby girls were betrothed to the older men. And that meant that when she came of age, not before, but when she came of age, then she would marry him and become his wife. Well, the traditional culture, the traditional authority no longer exists. That's one of the great tragedies of colonialism all around the world, is that the indigenous leadership, the traditional authority, was destroyed, and in its place we got revolutionaries, right, who then adopted Western ways, and the Western ways aren't their ways. They're a foreign way. They don't quite work. They work for us, but they don't quite work for them, right? Because there are different people with different ways of doing things, different ways of thinking. And, as I said, doesn't fit. But what that means is that now young girls are betrothed to older men, just like in traditional society. And there's no one to say, hey, you have to wait until she's of age. And then, of course, we add in alcohol and drugs, which, of course, impairs people's intellect. It impairs people's judgment. You add all this together, and it leads to sexual abuse. And then, of course, I was also talking about how there's no discipline for children. Children are not disciplined because of this traditional belief. Now, the idea that children come from the stars and that children are divine, that idea is dead in Aboriginal society. But the idea that you don't discipline children has remained. So as I said, the very worst aspects of Aboriginal society continues on, and the very best aspects have died out. So that means that when you read about these sexual abuses, that's what's going on. The very worst aspects of Aboriginal society, which worked in prehistoric times because things had to be very strict so that everyone knew their place and everyone could survive. And now the circumstances are completely different. But those things have continued on. And then, of course, we also have the problem with women. There's a lot of violence against women, and some of that violence is quite extreme. And that is, again, part of traditional society. But in the past, there was a reason for the violence. The violence was because, as I said before, everyone had to know their place, because life was... They weren't living very much above animals, right? So if you did things that upset the tribe, that could have very, very serious consequences. People could die. That's a pretty serious consequence. That's not true anymore. So those methods that were once used to make sure that people actually stayed alive, even though they were harsh and brutal, they no longer have a justification, but they still survive. And then we also have the problem with the no property. Because there's no property, traditional Aboriginal society is about cooperation. All right? So if I'm an Aboriginal person and you come to me as in traditional society and you say, oh, I need this, then I'm obligated just to give it to you. But in return, I can go to you and say, oh, I need that, and you have to give it to me. That has not died. That still exists. So when a modern Aboriginal person gets a job, for example, all their relatives then go to them and say, oh, can you give me $10, brother? Can you give me this, brother? Can you give me that? And pretty soon he's like, well, why am I working? There's no advantage to me working, right? And he's right. There is absolutely no advantage to him working. And that, of course, stops Aboriginal people collectively from getting ahead. Now, unfortunately, the only way that an Aboriginal person can get ahead, and I've met Aboriginal people like this, is for them to completely reject their own people and their own culture. And they will basically live as if they're Westerners, as if they're white. And that, because that way they don't have any obligation. But it's a pretty heavy price not to be able to interact with your own family, to have to reject all of that just so you can get ahead in life. So what about the future? Well, I think the first thing we have to do is we have to accept the limitations of the Aboriginal people. Now, every person has limitations, and every people have limitations. And the Aboriginal people are no different. All right? They have virtues and they have vices. And that's true of individuals, and it's true of groups of people. And we have to accept that. And modern policy doesn't allow that to be accepted. All right? Everyone's the same. Everyone's interchangeable. And that's why these policies don't work. Right? We have these good ideas and good intentions, but because they're not tailored to suit Aboriginal people, they can't work, and they can never work. One of the limitations, and this is something I talked about with in the last episode, is that our civilization is not theirs. Aboriginal people, strictly speaking, don't have a civilization. They're living in someone else's civilization, and that's a bad thing. But there's no way to change that now. We all have to live with it. We all have to find a way to get over that. And we have to accept that that's one of the limitations that Aboriginal people have, that they are people who live in our civilization, and there's no other option. They can't not live in it, but they're not of this civilization. Now, one of the answers that people come up with is, we should just get rid of this problem, And occasionally people say, just kill them all, right? Which is obviously just pub talk. But a more serious suggestion is, they should have their own country. They are their own people. They're distinct. They should have their own country, and that way they can just look after themselves. But there's two problems with that. The first is that they're not capable of looking after their own country, right? And we've seen that with Aboriginal organisation after Aboriginal organisation after Aboriginal organisation, is that they're simply not capable of doing this. Their way of doing things is not our way of doing things. And in the end, we will have to step in and look after their country. But the second thing is that we are the only country that occupies an entire continent. Why would we ever give that up? Why would we give the Aborigines, for good reasons or bad, their own country, right? Why would we create two separate nations on this continent? It doesn't make any sense. So we can't do it, and we're not going to do it, and they can't make it work. So the other suggestion is, well, if they can't have their own country, why can't they have their own state? Indigenous land, and all the Aborigines live in Indigenous land. Well, for exactly the same reason that they can't have their own country, and that is that it wouldn't work. It would fail. And people then say, oh, well, who cares? They're not our people. Well, we should just let them do whatever. If they rot, well, they rot. But it neglects something about us. And white people are busybodies. White people stick their noses in other people's business, right? That's why Western civilization is the civilization of the earth, because we couldn't keep our noses out of other people's business. And that's not going to end. And we have to accept that. That's one of our limitations. We have to accept that these people are not going to be left alone by us, right? And that if it fails, we're going to feel bad about it, and we're going to want to fix it, and we're going to want to do something about it. And we should just not allow that situation to develop in the first place. So the third option that many people have is integration. Aboriginal people we just stop worrying about Aboriginal culture, Aboriginal race, Aboriginal languages. We should just say, nah, you're just Australian, that's it, and you just got to integrate. You just got to be like all the rest of us, right? Well, there is a problem with that, and that is that we've already tried it and it didn't work, right? Because they are a distinct people. We have to accept that. We have to accept that they're not dark-skinned white people, right? We have to accept that they are their own distinct people, and we have to work within that framework. So what can we do? What can we do to actually make things better? Well, the first thing is that Aboriginal people have to have hope. All people have to have hope. And one of the great things that you notice when you look at Aborigines is that so many of them don't have any hope. This is as good as life gets, and life sucks. That's a terrible place to be. And there are certain things that we can do to give people hope. And one of those things is jobs. And that's true for Aboriginal people, and it's true for white people, is that, if you have a job, if you have a purpose in life, if you have an aim in life, then things get better, right? And sure, having a job creates its own problems. We all know that. But it also solves a lot of problems. And there are jobs that Aboriginal people can do. Now, one of the things that I hear is that we have to get rid of all these Aboriginal settlements and Aboriginal communities, and they all have to move to the towns and cities and get jobs here and so forth. Well, that's not necessarily true. I mean, first of all, there's a lot of jobs that can be done through the internet. There are jobs that need to be done in the local area, and there are jobs that need to be done in mining and agriculture, right? Where they may have to leave for a few months or a few weeks or whatever, but, they come back to their own communities. One of the things I found, I was in the Army Reserve, and in the early 90s, I went up and I did this long-range vehicle patrol through the Northern Territory. And I was really, I just thought that Aboriginal people would live lives pretty much like white people, right? I certainly wasn't a race realist then. And I was actually quite shocked that at how different they lived, how it was like the third world. And I remember I went to this small Aboriginal community, it's probably about 10 houses, all on stilts in the middle of the bush. And we drove on this road, and there was a very well built, very lovely looking police station, and it was all in stone. And so we stopped there and spoke to them, and let them know what we were doing and so forth. And we asked, why is the police station so far away from the community? And the police officer said, oh, well, what happens is, they get drunk, they get upset about life, they decide that it's the white man's fault, and they come to the police station to burn it down. And the reason that it's so far out of town is by the time they walk here, they're all tired, right? So we just go out and say, oh, you've had a bit too much to drink, and send them off home, right? But then when we arrived in the community, as I said, it was in the bush, right? So it's not like you think of farmland. No, you think of a wild forest, but people have built houses in it, and there's a road through it. And there were only 2 buildings that weren't houses. One was a general store, which was boarded up and graffitied all over. It looked like it had come straight from the Bronx. And right next to it was a kindergarten, and the lawn was immaculate. Right? You could have taken it and put it in any white suburb anywhere in the world, and it would have looked exactly how it should. Now, there you can see some of the social problems that exist. And one of them is jobs. People, they need things to do, right? And we also have to encourage the best in Aboriginal society, because traditional Aboriginal society had lots of good features, right? And what's happened is the best features have died, and the worst have come to the fore, right? So Aboriginal men today are not warriors, but traditionally every Aboriginal man was a warrior, right? And because I've talked about this in other places, Aboriginals have a rightful place here in Australia. But if something has a rightful place, it also has a wrongful place. And what we keep seeing is that wrongful place, where everything is about the grievance. Everything is about creating more problems, creating more hostility, instead of actually providing any solutions. And on the right, we're actually capable of providing solutions and of being rational people. Something that, unfortunately, the left seems not to be able to do. And liberalism, while it can be logical and rational, it doesn't accept that the Aborigines are a unique and distinct people. It just thinks, hey, they're just like everybody else, and that's how they treat them, and it doesn't work. We can actually provide answers for that. Well, at 38 minutes, I think I will end it there. I hope that people have some interesting comments to leave, and I will see you next week. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.